How will the deployment of 5G affect our wildlife, our birds, our bees, our trees? I'm going to start out with this large-scale installation by the Barisha Club of India that was created to educate the community about what 5G will mean for the birds. This exhibit won many awards. What a way to raise this issue and elevate it in the community. Let's talk about trees. Court rulings worldwide have confirmed that internet connections are more valued by society than trees. And there are many news reports, there's court rulings where one neighbor had a problem with the other neighbor's trees, and who won is, of course, the need for the internet connection. This is from a New Zealand ruling that undue interference with a Wi-Fi signal caused by trees could constitute undue interference with the reasonable use and enjoyment of someone's land. The heading of the news article was "Court Rules, Trees Blocking Broadband Can Face the Axe." And one of the company representatives said that trees were interfering with wireless broadband, and that's not that uncommon. You can put up a base station and the customer puts up an antenna on their roof, and then all of a sudden, 5 or 10 years down the track, some trees grow and it starts to degrade the signal. Now, of course, the signal is going into the trees. So when a signal is blocked, sometimes it's reflected and oftentimes it's absorbed. Here's another example from Devon Live. There was a news article about this heritage tree that was trimmed and the community in uproar. Here's an image from residents and demonstrators in a town in France trying to block the installation of a 5G antenna belonging to the telecom company Free. This is from Le Telegram, as loggers were proceeding to fell about 20 trees in an area where the antennas were to be located. They climbed the trees, they hung signs. We have that on our website on the page on 5G, the facts about 5G page. Here's another image from a news article about residents who are trying to stop putting up this huge cell tower, and where, of course, they have to cut down trees to put the cell tower. So you really need to have protections for trees. Now, in Washington, D.C., there actually are some protections, not good enough for trees. And when small cells came and there was all this, there was years of work looking at how are we going to put in 5G. And this was from an 8-hour hearing in front of the Washington, D.C. Council member Che, where the Sierra Club testified.
DDOT's draft small cell design guidelines state that trees shall not be removed or have their critical root zones damaged for the installation of small cell infrastructure. It's a good thing that DDOT has thought about the effect that this small cell technology will have on the trees of D.C. However, deeper consideration of the issue is needed. Specifically, the District of Columbia must ensure that street trees are not aggressively pruned as D.C. moves towards small cell infrastructure. This technology requires a direct line of sight between small cells. That could require chopping off large portions of tree branches, which could kill some of the district's largest and most majestic trees. Trees do not flourish with aggressive pruning. When they die, it takes decades to grow new trees the size of the large canopy trees that have been lost. That's not worth a slightly faster game of Angry Birds or a faster download of the latest Ariana Grande song. That's not to say expanding small cell technology isn't important. Like nearly everyone else in this room, I use my smartphone a lot, probably too much. I understand the need for faster data on wireless devices, but that should not come at a cost of damaging our tree canopy, which is just beginning to recover after decades of neglect. The Sierra Club requests that before the deployment of small cell technology, the district undertake a study of how this infrastructure will affect DC's trees. We asked that the DC government develop a plan to ensure maximum protection of our trees and our tree canopy, not just making sure trees aren't cut down and protecting the roots, but also protecting tree branches from heavy pruning. We cannot and should not try to prevent the advancement of 5G technology in the district, but we must ensure that our trees and our tree canopy are protected for future generations, for your granddaughter, for millions of others, and for the future of the climate.
And trees are really important in terms of their shade and reducing our energy needs in terms of the AC use, as well as what they do for the climate. So you can go online to our YouTube channel and you can use those clips. We also have his entire testimony at Environmental Health Trust, ehtrust.org. But really, we need better protections than anyone has so far. I mean, in DC, which is a good start, but not good enough, they have setbacks. They state that a tree can't be replaced, can't be pulled out.
Clearly, district officials believe, as I do, that trees are a key part of, and I borrow a phrase here from the guidelines themselves, a key part of DC's cultural landscapes. And it is this belief that gives me concern about the likely need to prune trees for line-of-sight transmission between cells.
The question is, who's enforcing it, right? Who in your community is there, even if you have these rules, and you have to have really good, solid, meaningful rules, but where is the enforcement mechanism? Where's the oversight? How really will anyone know what's actually going on? And that's a whole other piece to the deployment of 5G that often gets overlooked as these are streamlined in front of our homes, which is oversight and enforcement. And we really are calling on elected officials at every level of government to begin the process of being accountable on those fronts. As you know, there are many cell towers and small cell installations where they're not even following their permit. We have found that in Montgomery County. I know many other communities are as they pull the permits and they learn about this issue, they're finding the same thing. This is being rammed through so quick that public safety is just being left in the dust. The other issue around trees is, of course, the injury from radio frequency radiation. And this is a very important study because it was a field study over almost a decade where they followed dozens of trees. And they found that there was an impact when there was a line of sight to the tree. They took meters and they had trees that they identified, and then they would go back to check on them and measure the radio frequency radiation levels on one side of the tree and on the other side of the tree. And they found that where the radiation levels were higher because of a line of sight antenna, like as you see in here, that the canopy started thinning and there was serious impacts, and in many cases, the trees ultimately had to be felled. And their statistical analysis demonstrated that electromagnetic radiation from mobile phone masts is harmful for trees. They also have, the authors of that study also have a companion report where they have pictures and they show trees at different years so that you can see this is the same tree, and over time how there's that thinning. They show where the antenna is in relation to the tree. I mean, when you have a situation where you have a tree with this unusual thinning on one part, it's not so hard to begin to discover what could be doing that. So this again is at Environmental Health Trust. We have a section on trees, an entire page dedicated to the research on trees. When anything comes up, we try to put it on there. If there's anything that we're missing, please let us know. This is a really interesting talk that was done several years ago in the Netherlands about tree damage from electromagnetic radiation.
Today I have absolutely no remaining doubt that weak technical electromagnetic fields are able to cause harm to living organisms. I show you 3 of the most important results. Spatially inhomogeneous high-frequency field distributions cause spatially inhomogeneous tree damage. You have to know that today the real high-frequency field distribution is not uniform in a given space due to the interference of different high-frequency fields from a very great number of HF transmitters. If I would here make a measurement, I surely would measure more than 100 high-frequency fields from different transmitters, and they superpose. The real high-frequency field distribution is spatially inhomogeneous. Every 10 centimeter you have another field distribution because of the superposition from the reflection from the different situations. You see this tree is very inhomogeneous damaged. The top is more healthy than the left downside. This maple tree, also direct in the Federal Office of Radiation Protection, is damaged very slightly.
Hello, I'm Andrew Goldsworthy. I'm a retired lecturer from Imperial College London. And when I was working there, for many years, one of my pet interests was how animals and plants use electric currents, that is, natural electric currents that they generate themselves and use for all sorts of purposes. Now, first let me explain a little bit about how electricity flows through plants and animals. It's carried by ions, that is, electrically charged atoms and molecules that flow through their cells. Now, these currents are generated by ion pumps in the cell membrane that drive ions through the membrane using metabolic energy. This is a typical bacterial cell. It's surrounded by a membrane, and it uses its metabolic energy derived from its food to pump hydrogen ions, positively charged hydrogen ions, out through the membrane. This generates an electrochemical gradient, and some of those hydrogens are let back in again, and their energy is used to generate ATP from ADP. Now, ATP is the main energy currency of the cell, and it's also used to pump nutrients into the cell against a concentration gradient. So the energy of the hydrogen ion gradient is used for 2 main purposes, that is, to generate ATP and to pump in nutrients. These are, of course, delivered electrically, and there is an electrical circuit carrying these hydrogen ions round and round and round. And as you can imagine, the insulator has to be very good, that is, the cell membrane. If anything happens to make that membrane leak, then it short-circuits the whole system, and none of the processes will work properly, if at all. We've already seen that plant cells use DC currents extensively, but not alternating currents. Alternating electromagnetic fields damage cell membranes by removing structurally important calcium ions, and it results in the cells leaking. This was first discovered in the 1970s by Suzanne Borwin and her co-workers in Rossadi's lab. And I can explain briefly why this loss of calcium is important. Cell membranes consist of negatively charged components which are held together by positively charged calcium ions. It's rather like the bricks in a wall are held together by the cement in between them. The positive ions hold together the negative membrane components. If you take some of this calcium away, the membrane becomes weaker and more inclined to leak. Now, this sort of leakage can short-circuit the membrane potentials that we have already seen and reduce the efficiency of energy production and energy utilization, and perhaps also disrupt the orderly growth of polar cells. But perhaps the most serious effect of membrane leakage is through the membranes of lysosomes and vacuoles. Lysosomes in animals, vacuoles in plants. This is because these organelles are membrane bound and they contain various toxic materials and also digestive enzymes that are normally used to recycle unwanted materials.
So let's talk about birds. Now, this image, shockingly, is actually from a presentation to the International Telecommunications Union by an industry representative. And I found it shocking that this was an image. It was not about birds at all. It was just about the cell tower. And I guess I don't know why. Maybe they liked that there's a bird on the antennas. But this is a whole other conversation that needs to be had. What about the birds that perch on the antennas?
We've known certainly that electromagnetic fields have affected trees. We've gone on the studies in Spain by Dr. Alphonse Balmori in the last few decades, where he's been looking at the effect on storks or on house sparrows. You know, these birds that enjoy sharing the urban environment with us and have been perfectly capable of doing that over centuries and eons, are now showing great declines in the number of bird species. There's even studies on the migration of birds that show that birds have a naturally occurring, as all life does, amount of magnetite that allows them to sort of follow the ley lines of the earth. The geomagnetic field of the earth is how they migrate over great distances, and that these unnatural fields are in fact deflecting them off of their migratory patterns, their migratory routes, and in some cases drawing them right into the towers, which leads in many cases to bird strikes and bird deaths when they hit the guy wires of the very large telecommunications towers. Frogs, recent studies done by Alphonse Balmori in Valladolid, Spain. He put Faraday cages over one tank of tadpoles, or eggs, in this case frog eggs, within 140 meters of an antenna, and then left the other tank with the frog eggs out fully exposed to electromagnetic fields. And as the eggs hatched, he watched the development of the tadpoles, and the ones that were protected by the Faraday cage showed completely normal development. The ones that were out in the open, exposed to electromagnetic fields, showed poor form development. Some actually outright died, and others just never really got up to the actual energy and speed that the other tadpoles developed.
When the companies go out and they measure how much radiation is that cell tower emitting and how much radiation is that 5G cell tower emitting, they come up with these reports, mostly all of which show, of course, that they don't exceed limits for the person on the ground. But in the reports, it's quite clear that limits are exceeded several feet out from the antennas. There's a plume, it goes out so many feet. I know that in Montgomery County, our plume went out 10 feet for what they called their worst case scenario, 3 carriers on the quote unquote small cell. So in that case, we're talking about not only levels of radiation which are compliant, that the birds and of course any insects that are nearby or tree limbs, but also levels that exceed FCC limits. And what does that mean for the birds, for their reproduction, for their offspring? These two publications are so important, and there's one more on the way. International experts on this issue, Blake Levitt, Dr. Henry Lai, and Albert Manville. And Albert Manville, by the way, was the lead biologist at the US Fish and Wildlife Service who worked on the issue of impacts of communications towers. And he's now retired. He's at Johns Hopkins, he's teaching, he's writing. But they put together this incredible 3-part series, and only 2 have been published so far, where they look at the research on non-ionizing electromagnetic fields to flora and fauna. They found that ambient levels of these frequencies have risen sharply, that flora and fauna are sensitive to the exogenous electromagnetic fields in ways that may surpass human reactivity. These are artificial electromagnetic fields, not coming from their own bodies, but the fields that are coming from these human-made devices, which are transmitting, or industry, which is creating those fields from different electrical systems. They found biological effects broadly across all species and wildlife, and at very low frequencies. Impacts include impacts to orientation, migration, food finding, reproduction, mating, nest and den building, territorial maintenance and defense, longevity and survivorship, and they found genotoxic effects, which have been observed in studies. Now, in these 2 papers, there is tables. The most recent one that was published just a few days ago, actually, part 2. So let me go back to this. There's part 1, and there's part 2, and part 3 is on the way. They have tables where they have different studies, what the power density was, the level of exposure, and they have the effects observed. So I'll just read to you an excerpt from part 2, which was just published. Taken as a whole, this indicates enough information to raise concerns about ambient exposure to non-ionizing radiation at ecosystem levels. Wildlife loss is often unseen and undocumented until tipping points are reached. It is time to recognize ambient electromagnetic fields as a novel form of pollution and develop rules at regulatory agencies that designate air as a habitat so that electromagnetic fields can be regulated like other pollutants. Long-term chronic low-level electromagnetic field exposure standards, which do not now exist, should be set accordingly for wildlife, and environmental laws should be strictly enforced. So the laws that we have, the FCC rules or the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation, an invite-only club that has a big fancy name, but has no oversight as well, those limits, which many governments use as their limits, don't even consider our wildlife. So they were developed for humans. They don't protect humans, of course, as we talk about and as the science shows. However, they were developed for humans, not for our wildlife. And it's a gap in accountability that must be addressed. We shouldn't be rolling something out that's increasing levels of radiation when we have this mounting body of evidence and no limits to protect, no even look at what would be a safe level for various animals. Remember that the way, well, it's complicated how our bodies absorb or biological systems absorb electromagnetic fields, but different frequencies can resonate with different parts of your body in different ways. Electricity moves through different tissues at different speeds, in different ways, depending on that tissue. So in our body, we have bone, we have skin, we have fat, we have liquid, we have blood, all of that. The radiation moves differently through our bodies, and similar to insects into animals. And also the smaller the insect or the animal, when it matches the wave, there becomes resonance, and there can be deeper and more intense exposures than if you didn't have that situation. So as we go to 5G and the frequencies are increasing, those animals which are smaller are going to have a more intense absorption of the radiation. Dr. Albert Manville also has published book chapters. He has written to the US FCC. He has written to the FDA. He wrote to the FDA because the FDA came out saying, no need to worry about your US FCC limits, that, green lighted them. And he wrote saying, well, what about wildlife? So this is an excerpt from the another document that he put together, the bird and wildlife impacts of non-ionizing radiation, where he talks about field studies on wild birds. He actually cites a lot of research that has gone on with many different types of birds, and he calls on the FCC to address this, because it's just not being even considered in any of these deliberations on opening up new frequencies or deploying them. I wanted to make sure that you had seen the work of Alfonso Balmori. He published a 2020 research review entitled Electromagnetic Radiation as an Emerging Driver Factor for the Decline of Insects. And he talks about the link between both the lower frequency, power frequency fields, and the higher radio frequency wireless radiation and the decline of insects. He reviews research which has found loss of queen cells, changes to the weight gain of the hive, poor survival in winter, changes to propolization, I hope I said that right, changes to flight, foraging, and feeding, changes to short-term memory, and a causation of the worker piping signal, which can mean disturbance or preparation for swarming. It's a stressed, when bees are stressed, they will do the worker piping signals, reduced egg laying speed of queens, and changes to honey, lower weights, and increased mortality. He's done several papers, which are review papers, and they're really incredible and such important work. We have that Environmental Health Trust. You can look up his name on PubMed and get to the work of Alfonso Balmori and his colleagues.
This cell phone emits the waves, while this one receives the waves. At the same time, I have a device that records the sound that the colony makes in the beehive. This is why it is connected to a microphone placed under the beehive. Look at the waveform there. The thicker it is, the greater the intensity of the sound. When the phones are active, the colony is disturbed, and as soon as the phone's turned off, the colony reverts to its normal noise.
When it comes to the higher frequencies, there's not been, let me just say this, in all of the studies that looked at impacts to the environment, we don't have the body of research you would expect for such a widespread exposure, in that all that work of pre-market testing for the impacts of the environment, it has not been adequately done. So, and it's not funded. I mean, what's even being funded in the United States? Nothing that I know by the US government, except for the National Toxicology Program studies. They're doing some follow-up studies on 5G. But here, this study, which looked at absorption and the exposure, because of course, when you want to understand what an impact would be to a biological system, you have an exposure and you have your endpoints that you're studying. The exposure needs to be characterized so you know what the exposure was. How, and when you think about exposure, there's several pieces to it. One is what's coming out of the antenna. there's levels that are in the air, and then there's what's being absorbed into the body, sort of roughly breaking that down. But those are two different kinds of measurements. So this was a study that looked at the exposure of 5 insects. Actually, I have just here the images of the bee, and they looked at if you had different frequencies, looking at the higher 5G frequencies, how would the exposure to the bee be? At the same intensity, but those higher frequencies that we're talking about with 5G. And what you're seeing is like a heat map. So the lighter colors are the more intense levels, and the darker colors are less absorption, less intensity of absorption. So you have 2 gigahertz, 24 gigahertz, 120 gigahertz. And as the frequency goes up to actually match the size of the bee, there is a resonance and an intense absorption into the insect. Now, what this study is, I think one of the most important things about this study that I noted was first that it said, this is the first paper. So here we are late in the game as usual. The technology is rolling out, being rammed through in all of our communities. And we have our first paper to look at what would the exposure be to 5 insects. That's outrageous, really. That hurt my heart because, you know, it's collateral damage. So the authors in their conclusions on the more intense exposure from the higher frequencies as it matched the size of the insect, said this could lead to changes in insect behavior, physiology, and morphology over time due to an increase in body temperatures from the dielectric heating. And this study did not look at what are the behavior changes, but rather just the exposure. They also, the same authors, did a follow-up where they actually looked at the Western honeybee, but many different parts of the life cycle. The drone, the worker bee, the larva, the queen bee. And they found that as the frequency increases, the electromagnetic fields can be higher internally. And that is an image from that study. It's in Scientific Reports. These are very high quality journals that these have been published in. So climate, impacts to climate. This is an image where they are protesting 5G. And there are actually several actions by climate groups taking action on raising awareness of the energy consumption of 5G and the billions of devices which are going to be used for the Internet of Things. Greenpeace France released a position, as have actually several organizations like Ecologists in Action as well. And they're calling 5G a digital pollution that will increase carbon emissions, increase e-waste, strip the earth of natural resources, and contribute to human tragedies on a global scale. Ecologists in Action is a major environmental group in Spain that also issued a position on 5G calling for precaution. And they say, it is inevitable to ask ourselves, what kind of world do we want to live in? A hyper-digitalized, roboticized, monitored, controlled, and manipulated society, or a society where human relations, care, the common good, and democratic debates on key issues for our future take precedence? In other words, what will we put at the center, life or machine? I recommend this excellent article that's published in the Henry Jackson School of International Studies of the University of Washington on what will 5G mean for the environment. And Claire Caron goes over many of these issues, from the impacts to birds, bees, and trees, and also the issue of climate. I'm just going to read a quote from her. While the idea of more space for devices to be used is great for consumers, this will lead to a spike in energy usage for 2 reasons. The technology itself is energy demanding and will increase demand for more electronic devices. The ability for more devices will be used on the same network, and the It creates more incentive for consumers to buy electronics and to use them more often. And this will have an impact on the environment through increased energy use. Katie Alvord also did an incredible article on impacts of 5G and wireless technologies on the environment. And that's published in the Journal of the Journalists, the environmental journalists. And those are really useful starters for people who care about the earth. They're new to the issue of the environment and you want to raise awareness with them. So we know that 5G is an energy hog also because of the antenna systems and the way that the network itself, they are power hungry. Just a quote from the IEEE Spectrum, a 5G base station is generally expected to consume roughly 3 times as much power as a 4G base station, and more 5G base stations are needed to cover the same area. Now, in some areas of China, we understand that they're turning off the 5G stations when not in use to conserve energy. But of course, in a highly urban area, when would you turn it off if everyone's using it? So there is a lot of energy efficiency that companies are working on because they know they have to fix this problem, but it can't catch up with the billions of new devices, the millions of new antennas that are rolling out. I mean, it's overwhelmed. Any gains in efficiency are overwhelmed by the sheer number of devices and new equipment that we're talking about. And I haven't even touched on the impact, what's called embodied energy. And that is the impact from the manufacturing of the devices, the gathering of the raw materials that are put together to create, the metals, the conflict minerals. None of that, that's not included when we look at what's the environmental cost of our devices by our policymakers. But it should be, because of course, if they're going to replace 4G eventually with 5G or hop 5G onto the 4G, and people have the 2G and the 3G, we have to keep upgrading, right? I mean, constant upgrading needs to happen here. And those devices were built to last a short time. They are built to die, death by design. Hopefully you watched that fabulous movie and saw our Q&A that we did for the Jackson Hole Environmental Film Festival. The High Council of Climate in France issued a report on controlling the carbon impact of 5G. And they were a council of experts that the Senate brought in to take a look at this issue. The report is actually in French, and a lot of the news stories are in French, but you can just use, you can use Google Translate or translate the documents, and we were able to read the news articles that way. So really an impressive example of how policymakers are taking this issue seriously and getting independent look at the issue.
France's High Council on Climate has issued a stark warning. The deployment of 5G technology will lead to a sharp increase in power consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. The network's future carbon footprint can no longer be ignored.
La 5G, elle va rendre notre problème environnemental plus important si on ne l'encadre pas avec des mesures supplémentaires.
In a damning new report, the High Council explains that the technology per se is only the tip of the iceberg. Additional CO2 emissions will come mainly from data centers and the manufacturing of new electronic devices. Activists who have long fought against 5G services hope this latest assessment will help their cause.
Nous demandons effectivement un moratoire, maintenant qui est d'autant plus nécessaire que finalement le Haut Conseil dit qu'il faut évaluer l'impact des technologies avant de les mettre en œuvre.
So the High Council of the Climate found that 5G could add between 2.7 to 6.7 million tons of CO2 equivalents per year by 2030, that there were insufficient evaluations into the theoretical positive impact of 5G on the environment, such as the decrease in transportation demand or improvements in energy efficiency. And they have a long list of recommendations and findings that they have put together. You know, I was watching this excellent talk on this issue, and the author said, the speaker said, you know, 5G and machinery, they're agnostic. They don't have any reason to save energy or not save energy. It's what people do with the devices and how they, what we decide these devices will do and how they will do it that sets them down the path. So you can use 5G just as easily to increase the use of fossil fuels, or to you know, save money for companies that are polluting the earth, just as easily as it could be used for good. The SHIFT project from 2019, Lean Information Communication Technologies, ICT is the acronym, towards digital sobriety, our new report on the environmental impact, found the current trend for digital overconsumption in the world as not sustainable with respect to the supply of energy and the materials it requires. And they find the reasons are from 4 sources: the smartphone phenomenon, this just explosion of smartphones, and of course upgrading all your phones, the multiplication of the peripherals of daily life, the connected living, the rise of the industrial Internet of Things, and the explosion of data traffic. So the peripherals are all those other little things that are smart, that are being sold: the smart speaker, the smart watch, the smart, everything's smart, the dishwasher. I had to work so hard to get my washing machine and to get not a smart washing machine. And I wanted a smart washing machine that was also energy efficient. Let me tell you, that was super challenging. And we need people that know how to fix things now, because it is very hard to find anything that is not smart, that doesn't have a sensor, that doesn't connect with your smartphone. I was at a friend's house, and we were talking. It was my daughter's, a parent and my daughter, and I went to pick my daughter up, and he said, "Oh, wait a minute, I have to turn the oven off." He was standing next to the oven, like literally we were standing in the kitchen, and he used his phone to turn the oven off. Now I almost, and I said at first, I said, "Wait, what about the oven?" I thought maybe he was checking a text. I didn't know. He said, "I have to turn the oven off." He did something on his phone, and it turned out that he was turning the oven off with the phone in the kitchen. So, and then there's the industrial Internet of Things, and the explosion of data traffic, all of this video moving, all of this cloud computing, and all of the SHIFT report looks at the minerals, as I talked about, the full life cycle of the device. And they have a 2-page PDF, really important to go to the website. We have it on our website as well. Get that PDF that's a 2-pager, because it's the summary of the report. And you can share that with people who are interested in the environment and interested in climate. And this is an example of one of the graphs looking at the different possible scenarios. In other words, let's look at what the energy use will be if we make certain gains. And they had a worst case, a best case, expected case. However, it's going up. There's no doubt that our energy consumption is going to go up unless we act urgently. There was a study done by the Federal Environment Ministry and the German Environment Agency. And what they found when they looked at streaming is that while 5G actually uses less greenhouse gases than 4G, the most efficient is wired, when you have wired connections for streaming. And the cloud begins with coal was actually a report that was done by the American Coalition for Clean Coal Energy, which is the big coal companies in the fossil fuel industry. And they talked about how the demand for technology is outstripping the increase in efficiency. Everything I've been talking about, but here almost a decade ago saying, here's what's going to happen. And this is really good for the coal companies, because they're energy is going to be needed for the data centers, the broadband wireless networks, end-use devices, and so forth, the manufacturing facilities. There's also a lot of reports like this. This is an environmentally sustainable 5G deployment. It's a kind of a industry, groups that are, there are many groups which are trying to help industry. So they come up with these reports about what they can do better, or just reports about what's going on. And this is a report that was looking at how to make 5G deployment more sustainable. And they have recommendations in there, recommendations for wireless technology, quite specifically, because, but what they do is they break down the technical details of why 5G is going to be so power hungry, why the equipment is, because of the network elements. I'll just read, like the energy hungry baseboard units, the remote radio heads, the small cells, and the core networks. And we have on our website, the European Parliament actually did a talk on impacts to the environment. And Arno Thielens, who was a lead researcher that I showed you, that research about the bees, he did a presentation on a paper, Environmental Impacts of 5G. Now, what he says that, we need more research to fully understand this, and that there's all of these data gaps.
And since we might have irreversible damage to human health and environment, as the European Parliament's several reports advise, we would like to call more to inform citizens with specific studies, and follow the resolution 1815 of the Council of Europe to demand that a new assessment will be carried out by an independent task force. So I think we also should draft a letter that we can call for colleagues to co-sign, and call for the European Union to proceed with this assessment.
Really thankful that the European Parliament is even beginning this conversation. It is a conversation that needs to be had. Just think we're about closing in, so I want to just show you this resource. Please check out our Climate Change 5G and the Internet of Things. It's a 2-pager. It's hyperlinked. You can download this. You can send it to people who care about the issue, and then they can have a resource that they can click on to learn more. So everything is hyperlinked to the source.
And did the FCC create limits to protect trees and insects? And are these limits developed with any thought of protecting trees and insects?
That's a good question. So the limits in the rules themselves are refer to human exposure, and that's really the main purpose here.